started. My name is Jan Sveinar. I'm director of the Center on Global Economic Governance and professor at CIPA here. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you on behalf both of Center on Global Economic Governance, but also the Harriman Institute and its former and future director, Professor Timothy Fry, who many of you know here, take courses with, have been to his lectures. And it's a pleasure also to welcome you on behalf of the East and Central European Center here. So we have a three-center institutes co-sponsorship of this lecture and discussion. And finally, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Kraus here. Again, many of you know him. He is a professor at Middlebury College. He is currently at Charles University in Prague, where he's holding the Fulbright Fellowship, prestigious fellowship to travel and do research and teaching abroad. He is one of the foremost experts on political developments in Central East Europe, and actually is also, in addition to his academic credentials, currently chairman of the Academic Council of the Czech Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, which is one of the 7 institutes in the region in various countries that is trying to preserve documents and interpret, study, analyze what's going on. So we will have Professor Michael Kraus give some introductory remarks for about 35-40 minutes. Professor Fry has agreed to be the first person to react and say a few words of his own, given his expertise, and then we'll open it up for questions, answers, discussion from the floor. So, Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan and Tim. I'm grateful to be here and thankful for the opportunity to visit Colombia again. I was a research fellow at the Harriman Institute and the Institute on East Central Europe back in the 1980s, so it's great to be back. It's a terrific and warm place for me to return to. How did I get into the subject of transitional justice? What is transitional justice? In what's significant about it? Well, about 20 years ago, I gave a paper at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association on the then emerging subject of property restitution policies and lustration, so-called, policies in post-communist Europe. And it was one of those typical things where, you know, you go to a conference and you hope there's like 1,000 panels and you're hoping that the number of people coming to your panel will exceed the number of panelists. And we were happy with the ratio that day, and I thought, well, that's that. Well, some months later, much to my surprise, I got an invitation to submit my paper for consideration in a forthcoming volume, and it was eventually accepted in a somewhat chopped up way, and it appeared in a 3-volume study called Transitional Justice, edited by Neil Kritz, issued by the U.S. Institute of Peace. And so the field of transitional justice was being born, and Neil was one of the founding fathers, and unwittingly I found myself being part of that. Today, of course, as many of you know, we have countless publications on the subject of transitional justice. We have here in New York the International Center for Transitional Justice, which is involved in counsel and policy advice to countries transitioning from mass violations of human rights. A journal, International Journal of Transitional Justice, was launched about 5 years ago, dedicated to the subject. And Cambridge University Press has just issued a 3-volume encyclopedia of transitional justice with contributions from 166 scholars and practitioners. Indeed, Colombia has many distinguished contributors to this field. Well, what is transitional justice? transitional justice aims to provide accountability for legacies of human rights violations, and thereby to promote civic trust and the rule of law. A variety of approaches and mechanisms which comprise transitional justice include national and international tribunals, truth and reconciliation commissions, administrative measures such as vetting of public employees. This is where lustration comes in. But they also include rehabilitation and compensation, at least symbolic, of victims, restitutions of property, and projects concerning memorialization of a difficult past. Now, a lead contribution in the current issue of East European Politics and Societies by Jacques Rupnik and Jan Zielonka, two leading specialists, argues that in recent years, scholars have had particular problems in plausibly explaining three issues at the center of the political debate across the region. And one of those three issues is the sustained importance of the politics of memory and historical justice. So with that last issue in mind, I would like to reflect briefly on the 20-plus year record of dealing with the communist past in Central and East Europe. And to do so, of course, I have to rely on the extensive scholarship of many colleagues, not all of whom I can acknowledge here in the short time I have available. Needless to say, I'm going to generalize. It's pretty audacious of me to try to do this. So I'm going to have to generalize and therefore oversimplify a much more nuanced picture, touching especially on three questions. One, is there any discernible pattern of transitional justice in East and Central Europe we can identify? Second, why did, at least initially, different countries in the region adopt different strategies of transitional justice? And third, in what ways are the approaches adopted by the countries in this region similar or different to those of other regions? So let me begin with a story. I'm spending this academic year, as you've already heard, in Prague. And the biggest political event of the past year was the first direct presidential elections. Colombia's own Jan Švejnar was a year ago or last year considered a leading contender. But in the end he decided, much to the chagrin of many Czech voters, that he'd rather dedicate himself to the new institute he directs here at Columbia than to the vagaries of Czech politics. A wise decision. Now, be that as it may, this January's presidential debate between the two finalists pitted Miloš Zeman, the former Social Democratic Prime Minister, and Prince Karel Schwarzenberg, the current Foreign Minister, and the leader of the center-right party, Top 09. Schwarzenberg was asked his view on the issue of Edward Beneš post-war decrees, which led to the expulsion of nearly 3 million Germans, Sudeten Germans, from post-war Czechoslovakia. And in his reply, Schwarzenberg casually stated that, and I quote, "What we committed in 1945 would today be considered a grave violation of human rights, and the Czechoslovak government, along with President Beneš, would have found themselves in The Hague." instantly what appeared until then to be a reasonably conducted and reasoned campaign by the two candidates degenerated into an orgy of chauvinism, nationalism, and populism, abetted in no small measure by Václav Klaus, the outgoing president, whose comments only added fuel to the fire. Not only did he get involved, but his wife and his son, and they all said what a terrible thing Schwarzenberg said and what he stands for. In any event, despite the fact that both candidates, both Zeman and Schwarzenberg, have very similar views in reality on this matter, they didn't actually differ in terms of the comments Zeman made before, one's attitude towards the Beneš decree suddenly became a test of one's patriotic credentials. To make matters worse, a few days later, on the first day of the election, a full-page ad appeared in the largest tabloid daily, accusing Schwarzenberg, falsely, of colluding with the Sudeten Germans. And a couple of days later, after the election was over, and Mr. Zemano had won, it was revealed that the ad was placed into the paper by a former officer of the secret police. The Zeman campaign team declared it had nothing to do with us, and that was that. Now, many Czechs and local commentators were surprised that the Beneš decrees, an issue that goes back almost 70 years, could ignite such an intense row and debate. After all, Europe in general, the European Union, the Czech Republic, confront some really crucial social and economic problems today. Why get so carried away with relatively long-distance past? The Beneš decrees do not figure at the top of the list of the current priorities. And in fact, they had not figured in the debate since the 1990s, when the 1996 Czech-German declaration on the subject was signed, and since the Czechs had joined the European Union, this issue did not serve as a bone of political contention. So the point is that the involvement, and I should add, the involvement of a former agent of state security also underlined and reminded people of the shadowy presence and influence of such people in the society. So these incidents illustrate how quickly and easily the past can be politicized in this part of the world. And they demonstrate that the past is really not even the past. Or as the old anecdote one could hear back in the days of the Soviet Empire has it, the future is certain, merely the past is continuously changing. So let us make a brief tour through the haunted lands, to use Tina Rosenberg's expression, of East Central Europe's transitional justice. To begin with, it's very hard to generalize about this entire region. But if we simplify the matter a great deal and consider the record of transitional justice to consist of a point on an imaginary line between prosecutions and punishment and at one end, and forgiveness and amnesia at the other, we will immediately be struck by the great deal of divergence in transitional justice policies in Eastern Europe over the past 20 years. Most countries fall somewhere between the two end points. And I'm leaving aside the special case of the former Yugoslavia, which obviously involves charges of genocide and deals with a host of other issues. So at one end, we find the experience of the former Soviet Union, where the gravest of crimes were committed in the course of more than 70 years of Soviet rule. As we know, there was little justice to emerge in Russia in the post-Soviet era, and not much truth either. On the contrary, the then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev somewhat unexpectedly co-sponsored the establishment of what might be labeled an anti-truth commission in May 2009, entitled the Presidential Commission of the Russian Federation to Counter Attempts to Falsify History to the Detriment of Russia's Interests. That's the title. Its official mission was to, quote, defend Russia against falsifiers of history and those who would deny Soviet contribution to the victory in World War II. And various Russian spokesmen actually involved the Holocaust denier laws as an example, as a precedent for what the Russian Duma ought to consider. In fact, a draft law was being bandied about. Now, it soon became clear that the purpose of this commission was to counter the purported falsification of Russian history occurring allegedly, especially in neighboring Baltic countries. But following strong criticism and protests from both domestic critics as well as American Historical Association, the ACES, and other bodies abroad, that such an action, the creation of this commission, contradicts the basic principle of intellectual freedom. The commission was actually quietly disbanded, having met in a few sessions. It was quietly disbanded by presidential decree last year. Outside of the Baltic states, the record of other Soviet successor states regarding transitional justice does not offer much encouragement either. Now, Lavinia Stan's recent survey of the region, which examined criminal prosecutions, or what scholars call retributive justice, lustration policies, and access to secret police archives, it concluded that Albania, Slovakia, and Slovenia adopted, or what can best be described as forgive and forget approach. While Germany, by contrast, the Czech Republic, and the 3 Baltic states have pursued transitional justice most vigorously. Having had the rich historical experience in dealing with a traumatic past, Germany of the 1990s seemed ever determined to settle accounts after communism. It became the only country that actually pursued all of these measures, to have done it all, as it were. Conduct extensive criminal trials, carry out a vetting of public employees, purges, in fact, establish an independent authority, the so-called Gau Commission, to organize and put public use of the archives of the secret police, as well as to launch 2 truth commissions, whose findings were issued in a report over 15,000 pages long about the nature of the East German regime and its crimes. Germany, of course, was an exception insofar it already had ready for action, rule of law institutions, including independent judges, prosecutors, lawyers, in short, a professional state apparatus. Second, Germany was also able to invest significant resources that are required to conduct transitional justice on this scale. Now, Germany's model became an inspiration in East and Central Europe, but in the absence of these 2 conditions, factors that I just mentioned, namely the rule of law institutions, independent courts, and formidable financial resources, these were also the very reasons why Germany's model could not be emulated anywhere else in the region. So scholars have devoted a fair amount of attention to the question of why different countries in the region adopt different strategies of transitional justice. After all, it seemed at the outset that given the shared legacy of communist totalitarianism and its crimes, one would expect similar responses to dealing with the past. So what factors best explain the different strategies of transitional justice that countries and governments adopt? This became a major question for scholars. And among the first to pose it was Samuel Huntington, as many of you know, in his third wave, his study of some 35 countries that underwent democratization between 1974 and 1990. And Huntington pointed out the wide-ranging debate in all of these countries, in many of these countries, about the moral and legal issues concerning what to do about the so-called torturers. He called them bluntly, and their bosses. But he concluded, and I quote, "In actual practice, what happened was little affected by moral and legal considerations. It was shaped almost exclusively by politics, by the nature of the democratization process, and the distribution of political power during and after the transition." Now, by the distribution of political power during the transition, Huntington meant whether the authoritarian regime or totalitarian regime exited with strength or whether they were replaced as a result of weakness. If they exited with strength, they did so typically through protracted negotiations with the opposition, as in Hungary or Poland, for example. Now, of course, Huntington was speaking about all the countries that included, his cases included Southern Europe and Latin America and so on. But they were kind of applicable to the changes occurring at the very time Huntington was finishing his book in 1989, 1990. Where authoritarian government, as far as his hypothesis is concerned, what Huntington was saying was that where authoritarian governments collapsed of their own defective weight or were overthrown, as in perhaps East Germany or Czechoslovakia, prosecution was more probable and more likely to be effective if it happened sooner rather than later. Subsequently, other scholars expanded and amended Huntington's propositions, pointing to the importance of other factors, such as the character of the preceding dictatorship, the nature of its crimes, the experience with pluralism prior to dictatorship, the attitudes, beliefs, and values of the opposition, as well as the new elite, and the role of international actors and norms. Abiezir Tucker, for example, in his work agreed with Huntington, but noted that post-totalitarian transitions were fundamentally different from post-authoritarian transitions. He argued that weak civil societies typical for post-totalitarian transitions were ill-equipped to contend with nomenclatura, which led the quest for power among the new political elites. In her recent and compelling account, Skeletons in the Closet, Monika Nalepa argues that in Hungary and Poland, the opposition's uncertainty about the degree to which it had been infiltrated by the communist regime curbed the retributive preferences and delayed lustration policies. She has some other interesting observations to make about this process, to which we can return perhaps in discussion. Now, my third observation concerns the different forms that transitional justice took in post-communist Europe compared to other regions, such as Latin America. While selective and often unsuccessful attempts at prosecuting and punishing former officials of the predecessor regime took place on both continents. Lustration policies and the opening of and the access to the security police archives became the dominant mode of transitional justice in post-communist Europe. By contrast, everywhere else, truth commissions emerged as the main vehicle of transitional justice. Some commentators, such as Timothy Garton-Ash, have repeatedly emphasized how and why truth commissions would assist the post-communist societies to establish an authoritative account of the crimes of the past. Yet, according to Amnesty International, from 1974, when the third wave started, to 2007, at least 33 truth commissions were established in 28 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But truth commissions remain largely absent in East and Central Europe. One of the few countries to implement a truth commission was Romania. A presidential commission, so-called for the analysis of the communist dictatorship, illustrates some of the main challenges truth commissions faced, or prospects of truth commissions faced in post-communist Europe. Established in 2006 and headed by Vladimir Tismaneanu, a political scientist at the University of Maryland with Romanian roots, the commission was charged by President Traian Băsescu to investigate the crimes and abuses of the totalitarian regime during 1945-1989 and to expose those responsible. It was not conceived from the beginning as a parliamentary commission with the backing of major political parties. And that also proved to be one of the problems subsequently. Nor did the commission hold hearings with the witnesses in the style of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's the one that's most written about and most familiar to us, perhaps. Also, the Romanian Commission did not involve, problematically, significant representation from civil society groups. Further, two of its members had to resign midway through because of their previous cooperation with the Securitate, the communist state security. Commission didn't have subpoena powers to summon alleged perpetrators, and it did not have an independent budget. So instead, its 30 or so members conducted intensive research for 7 months in what had been previously closed archives, and they issued a 660-page report by the end of the year, in a very short period of time, actually, and relative to the time constraint, they did as well as they could. The report exposed the nature of the Ceausescu regime. It identified those communist officials most responsible for the abuses and crimes, and it provided a voice for the victims. It therefore, in the main, fulfilled the purpose of truth commissions, which is to say, provide an authoritative account about the past. And President Băsescu endorsed the report before the parliament and proclaimed the Romanian communist regime as illegitimate and criminal. He implemented some of the commission's recommendations, not all, such as providing greater access to the archives of the communist regime. But the report created a major controversy and a debate about the past. But it was a debate such as Romania never had until that point about its communist past. In that it was valuable, but it also eventuated in the fact that a part of the Romanian political elite, both on the far left and the far right, rejected the report. So while truth commissions in Eastern and Central Europe have been an exception rather than a rule, parenthetically I would like to mention the rise in the past decade of various institutions that have been charged with the responsibility for housing the files of the secret police. The first, of course, was the Polish Institute of National Remembrance. Then followed the Slovak Nation's Memory Institute, and others, including the Czech Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes that Jan mentioned earlier. And they are responsible for secret police archives, as well as some research and analysis. Their responsibilities vary. Access to the materials also varies institute to institute. In fact, these institutes have formed a network, and the members of this network, I think 7 institutes, including the German one, just met in Prague last week, and they issued a report about their activities and their holdings and access issues. And I have a few that I brought for you. So if you're interested, let me know after the talk. In any event, as I said, similar institutions were also established in Bulgaria, in Hungary, and Romania. And their official mission, scope, and resources vary. In the Polish case, unlike in the others, the full name of the Institute of National Memory, it continues, Commission for the Prosecution of Crimes Against the Polish Nation. So that institute actually has powers to investigate and prosecute the crimes identified. Now, access to these files by the general public has become, in recent years, a form of search for truth, or truth revelation procedure, if you will. It is a distinctive contribution of East and Central Europe to the various instruments of transitional justice. As Lavinia Stan and Nadia Nedelski point out in their recent studies, files effectiveness, the secret police files as effectiveness as a tool of truth revelation depends on the authenticity, on the completeness and reliability of the material, none of which can be taken for granted, because the origins of these papers are obviously dubious. They are what they are. The issues and the institutions themselves that I have just mentioned have been a source of rich controversy. There's no doubt that the secret police files have left a toxic legacy. Yet there doesn't seem to be an easy solution to the problem. The right to know, if you wish to know, and not everybody does, the right to know how your life may have been affected or manipulated by the activities of state security is protected through the preservation of these files. Now, I happen to have had some role in an advisory capacity, not executive capacity, at this institute in Prague. And this institute has given the most open access to anyone interested in looking at these files. It's virtually open to anyone. Now, I'm not saying whether that's desirable, right, or wrong, but it has the most liberal policies of access of any of these institutions. I lost track of when we started, so...
you can go about 10 more minutes, 5
yeah,
more minutes,
okay.
yeah, whatever.
Well, Karel Vaš died last December 12th at the blessed age of 96. His name probably doesn't tell you much, but since his story illustrates both the trial and tribulations of communist regimes and the elusiveness of post-communist justice, let me briefly share it with you. He was born in Carpathian Ukraine, studied law in the 1920s and 30s, and he joined the Communist Party when he was 17. Running away from the Nazis, he sought an asylum in the USSR, but after crossing into Soviet territory in 1939, he was arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet security police. He was sent to the Gulag for 3 years, then released to join a newly formed unit of Czechoslovak army inside the USSR. By the end of the war, he had become a trustee of the NKVD and a deputy head of a military intelligence unit working under Soviet supervision inside post-war Czechoslovakia. After the communist coup in 1948, Vaš became a military prosecutor and judge who was complicit in torture of political prisoners and implicated in a series of judicious murders. He was actually charged and tried in 2001 for one of the crimes he committed under the communist regime. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. But an appellate court annulled the verdict on account of statute of limitations. Thus, Karel Vaš died in his own bed, and he could rightfully claim that he was never found guilty of any crimes he committed by any court in democratic Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic. He remained unrepentant, giving countless interviews. Posthumously, he appears in a documentary that was just released. And he never admits to any wrong whatsoever. His own daughter denounced him and announced that whatever proceeds would come from his estate, she would give it to charity to amend for his misdeeds. Even at his death, Vaš, or his case, served as a lightning rod for frustration and even anger directed at the Czech courts and judiciary. Yet the tale of Karel Vaš is a fairly typical story for Europe after communism. Here are some data to illustrate. Since the fall of communism 23 years ago, about 100,000 people, this number may actually surprise you, face charges for crimes committed, guess where? In communist Germany. But only around 750 have actually been convicted, and many received suspended sentences. In Poland, to this date, about 465 communist functionaries were charged, and only about 150, a third, were convicted of repression and human rights violations. One of the senior figures in the communist establishment, General Czeslaw Kiszczak, former interior minister, was given a 2-year suspended sentence last year for his part in the imposition of the crackdown against the Solidarity trade union. General Wojciech Jaruzelski's trial is still going on, now in about the 20th year. In the Czech Republic, where about 250,000 people had been charged under communism with political crimes and paid for that. 36 communist officials since 1989 were found guilty, but with only a handful of exceptions, their sentences were suspended. In Slovakia, no one went to jail for any crimes under communism, and so on. You get the picture. Here, I believe, we do come to at least one explanation for the point brought out by Jacques Rupnik and Jan Žižka, that is to say, the sustained importance of the politics of memory and historical justice in contemporary East Central Europe. In the widespread perceptions of their fellow citizens, former perpetrators have gotten away with relative impunity. And the figure of the defined and unrepentant Vaš is just a case study, a case in point. To put it in other words, retributive justice in Europe after communism has been surprisingly soft. I say surprisingly because the crimes of communism were extensive, took place over many decades, shattered many lives, and affected millions of people. I say surprisingly soft also because in the early 1990s, scholars did not expect this to be the case. So, soon after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and I'm winding down, especially following the adoption of the first lustration law in October 1991, Czechoslovakia, Western human rights activists, including the Helsinki Watch organization, leading lawyers, prominent media outlets such as the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and so on, warn against the excesses of decommunization in Eastern Europe, expressing grave concerns about witch hunts in Prague and elsewhere, and invoke the specter of McCarthyism haunting the region. Within a few years, however, it became apparent, as Stephen Holmes put it in 1994, that, and I quote, "the dreaded witch hunts have completely failed to materialize because the public appetite for purchase has proved vanishingly small." Thus, for Holmes, the unexpected move away from decommunization, in his own words, the startling absence of retributive politics, was in fact what needed to be explained. Why no Inquisition in East Europe? Holmes asked. He gave several possible explanations, including moral resistance to notions of collective guilt, skepticism towards the, what he called skepticism towards the politicization of historical memory, as well as the presence of more pressing and economic social problems. John Elster, who explored this question some years later, also concluded that one might have expected more extensive retributive measures in post-communist countries. And he, in fact, characterized the level of prosecutions in Germany and the Czech Republic as low, and describing it as a puzzle. His own response or explanation invoked the possibility that the sheer passage of time may account for differences in patterns of transitional justice. He argued that the hunger for punishment, or what he called the retributive emotions, tend to decay over time, as does the intensity of the demand for retribution. So given that the biggest wave of communist crime swept throughout Eastern Europe in the late 1940s and early 1950s, demands for prosecution and punishment were by no means as pronounced by the 1990s as Western observers had initially assumed. Like other scholars, Elster also mentions the scarcity of resources and the shortage of competent and untainted legal personnel as limiting factors in retributive justice. And to his list, one might add the restraining influence of the international context, international conventions on human rights, membership in the Council on Europe, and the Central and East European countries' prospective membership in the European Union transformed the legal environment in which Eastern and Central Europeans conducted transitional justice policies. Be that as it may, it seems fair to conclude that the overall record of transitional justice in post-communist Europe has hardly satisfied anyone within the region itself. It is worth recalling that Huntington concluded his analysis of the question as to whether one should prosecute and punish versus forgive and forget by imploring potential democratizers to recognize that, and I quote, each alternative presents grave problems, and that the least unsatisfactory course may well be do not prosecute, do not punish, do not forgive, and above all, do not forget. Strangely enough, these words, do not punish, do not forgive, and above all, do not forget, may well serve as an apt description of the 20-year record of transitional justice in Central and East Europe. Are we speaking then of a grand failure? Not necessarily. On reading Huntington's line casually for the first time 20 years ago, I have to confess that I was certain there was a typo in his sentence. Surely this did not, what he was describing was the least satisfactory course of action. But today, I have come to appreciate the underlying wisdom of Huntington's perspective. We should not think of transitional justice as a goal that can be attained at a certain point in time. And I think this is often the way in which at least some scholars and practitioners contemplate it. Rather, we should understand transitional justice to be an open-ended process, much like democracy itself, for the goals of truth and justice will always remain elusive, open-ended, and uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I will now ask Tim Fry to address the floor.
Thank you very much for a great talk on a fascinating topic that on the surface of it looks pretty straightforward, but as soon as you start to peel it back a little bit, you realize the many layers involved, the many opportunities for the political abuse of these documents and of these real historical memories. So I want to thank Michael for giving the issue its full richness and complexity, even though he claims he was simplifying. I also want to thank him for his work in trying to keep access to the documents that many people would not like to be made public, that will allow researchers to go back and perhaps with a more reasoned and apolitical, less political agenda, evaluate the period of socialism, communism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union because we know in a lot of countries in the region, access to those archives is not available. So that if you were able, in some small corner of it, to carve out access to these documents, that's a great thing. Okay, a couple of analytic points, and I wonder if I could just get your reaction. One is I'm glad you mentioned Monica Nalepa's work, in part because she's a Columbia PhD, and we're always looking to endorse our own. And she has an argument that I find very clever. But I've never felt competent enough to really judge whether or not I actually buy it. So the argument is that we see lots of these laws passed under leftist governments, and that the biggest proponents of lustration, ironically, in the region are the ex-communist parties, in part because they know much better what's in the archives and who collaborated and what the degree of collaboration was, whereas the liberal parties, they don't know. And they're very uncertain, and if information comes out that the ex-communists collaborated, well, the news что? I mean, this is not news to anybody. But if news comes out that some of the leaders of the liberal parties collaborate, then this would be very costly politically. So it's a very clever argument, and I'm wondering whether or not you buy it, because it does, it does. The real argument really does rest on that. The next point I wanted to raise is whether you think that information is really the answer here. So would Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, had they been externally imposed, would they have changed the outcome in any way? In part, I'm reminded of the joke from the Soviet period where the dissident goes to Red Square and has a sign, holds up a sign, and the KGB comes and arrests him, and the KGB says, why is your sign blank? There's nothing written on it. And of course he says, why do I need to write anything? Everybody knows. Okay? Everybody knows about the problem. It's just because there is this debate among people studying transitional justice about whether or not Truth and Reconciliations Commissions are put in places where they're most likely to succeed. So we see a lot of progress, but they might have done just fine without the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And also a couple points about historical memory, and I'll take issue with my colleague Jan Elster. He's on leave this year, so he might not know about this notion that we can draw a straight line between the time at which the major crimes were committed and the likelihood that there would be prosecution after the fall of communism, because we have the example of solidarity and the crackdown and the introduction of martial law in 1981. That's only a decade. It's not that long ago. And one could also tell an opposite story about how crimes that were committed in the past can often be brought up and manipulated. Those are the easiest ones to manipulate and abuse. If we think, about 1389 in the Balkans, and how this is still a lively political issue, and nobody knows what really happened. So maybe it's not so easy just to draw a straight line. In part because one of the factors why the urge to purge the ex-Communist Party members, it might be that because the level of penetration was so great and there were so many people involved that once you start to prosecute people, everybody ends up on the same side of the issue because they all know somebody who collaborated, who cooperated, and they all have a reason for why they were different. There was some circumstance for which their collaboration was less heinous than somebody else's collaboration. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why the appetite for collective punishment is perhaps lower in the post-communist region than it is maybe in other regions, in South Africa maybe. So thanks for a great talk. So just wonder if you had a few thoughts, then we can open the floor up. So.
Well, these are great questions, Tim. And let me try to at least comment briefly on each of them, or each of them I could keep track of. Well, Monica Nalepa has a fascinating thesis, and it's very elegant, and she uses game theory to explain why there were pacts, transition pacts, and she also uses that to explain some patterns of transitional justice. Now, I have to say that when she speaks about the notion that the left in Poland or Hungary could take the lead in illustration policies because they had the evidence of massive collaboration by the opposition. That's an empirical matter. You would have to investigate the material, and you would have to go into the archives and look at a representative sample, and then draw conclusions based on that. I don't think it's sufficient to do what she does, which is she quotes somebody, somebody, even a communist or a former communist, who says, "Wow, we've got lots of these files we've seen." Okay, well, they will say that, but if this is going to be your hypothesis, or rather proposition, then I think you need to actually do the empirical work. And I don't see, at least in her book, the evidence of this work being done. So that's exactly that part of the book that, it's a kind of she says that she's not trying to cast judgment about the extent of collaboration, but at the same time, she makes this kind of an argument. So I find it somewhat perilously close to these conspiracy theories, at least lending credence to some of the conspiracy theories that abound in the region, where this notion that the Reds and the opposition had colluded to make a deal is rife. I'm not saying that that's what she does, but I'm saying she kind of, any simpleton reading her book. It's not for simpletons.
No. I blurbed it, so I think it was a good book.
It's a very interesting book.
Yeah.
So that's that. Now, your point about the passage of time and these and transitional justice and emotional attachments to prosecution, that's a very good one. We do find that the passage of time did not seem to stop these groups in Spain in recent years demanding investigations of mass crimes. Judge Garzón, I think is his name, gave the order that hundreds of graves should be opened in Spain. In order to search for what happened, for truth. So the passage of time didn't seem to make that go away. And one could cite other cases. I think your point about, we're just getting to this point now where we actually are looking empirically at the relationship between truth commissions and the, say, establishment of a rule of law, or what is the relationship. And in South Africa, which is the most studied Truth Commission, we're hard pressed to,
given the murder rate.
Exactly. So your point is very well taken. And I don't know whether I've answered all of them, but there are undoubtedly some. Yes, sir.
So please identify yourself briefly and pose a question or
Mel
comment.
Maskin, this issue that Huntington brings out about politics and how maybe people, their reluctance to continue being interested in this is maybe because they see both sides just using this, like instrumentalizing this, and just saying, well, you know, it's politics. You see, and once you label something as politics, people, I think, tend to move away and not be interested. Just see it as like a device in order to get votes. And is that a possibility?
I think so. I think that's a very good point. And in fact, these institutes of national remembrance, or whatever you want to call them, the 7 or 8, however many there are, they themselves have been subject to politics. So, you know, when there was center-right, it tended to be supportive of them, of their creation. I mean, it's a wonderful subject, and I invite some of you who are searching for a, you know, master's thesis topic, because this is fairly new, to look at the controversies surrounding these institutes or the politics of these institutes. And you're right that people are they grow wary of the instrumentalization of this issue.
Please.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I'm Peter Romein. I'm visiting from the Netherlands. I'm working with the Dutch Institute for the Memory of the Second World War. I can kind of relate to your topic. And perhaps it's interesting to remark as regards to the passage of time that the whole issue of the society, the surrounding society where it all happens. The Dutch resistance after a year said, well, we can't have no purge in an impure society. Society has been contaminated too much by collaboration as a general phenomenon. So why is there a purge? Of course there was a purge, because something had to be done to deal with the problematic heritage and the crimes of the Nazi regime in the Netherlands, including the indigenous Nazis. But it was a very long-term, long-running process. And I think, actually, hearing your talk, that my impression is confirmed that there is not one trajectory nor one specific set of repertoires to deal with such issues, and that you should have everything at the same time. That is trials, because they deliver some insight, but also a public sphere has to develop in which these issues can be addressed on very different levels.
Very good, thank you.
Probably more a comment than a question.
Well, I think there have been some interesting comparisons between the post-war trials of the collaborators and this transitional justice following the Second World War. And Luc Heise, is that how you pronounce it? Heise, has done some really interesting work on that. And he actually concluded, I believe, that the post-communist transitional justice was not as punishing as the post-war, and that greater attention was paid to the rule of law in terms of post-communist prosecutions. So it's obviously these are not the identical case, but they do invite some thinking in parallel terms, as you have done.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Leslie Grayson, you referred several instances to the civil society, rule of law, etc. Taking one country that I'm familiar with, I emigrated from there 64 years ago, but I've gone back a fair amount. The concept of a civil society or the rule of law are not felt attributes in Hungary. There was never a civil society in the last 11 centuries. And the rule of law, highly questionable. It's not that the prosecutors were incompetent enough or that the courts were incompetent enough. they always were appointed and favored the ruling government. And more importantly, I guess, the expectation of the people, the folk, that justice will be done is simply not there. It never was there. It wasn't there 50 years ago, and it's not there now. The idea of people get away with murder is much more likely to accept that rule than the rule of law. Another point, if I may still, may I? Other point is that if everybody is guilty, nobody is guilty. The communist infiltration of society was so pervasive, not just the people who are directly involved, but as Professor Fry said, the relatives of the people who were involved, the people who knew others beside the relatives and the people involved, that prosecuting certainly could have meant in the minds of people that everybody is guilty, and therefore, why prosecute? That wasn't the question.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your observation. I think that the last point is very penetrating. It's true that Václav Havel made a pronouncement on that very subject, saying that we are all co-responsible. He said in his inaugural speech in January 1990 for the post-totalitarian system. We were not just its victims, but also its tools or instruments. But what's interesting is, and this is an oft-quoted statement which you find in much of the literature on the subject, especially communist, the nature of the communist regime. But what people do not pay notice is that a few paragraphs later, Havel writes or says, he said, that was his speech on January 1st, 1990, he says, but of course, naturally, some people are more responsible than others. And they should be brought up to justice by independent courts and tried in the court of law. Now, that is not quoted as often. Now, of course, where were you going to get independent court of justice in post-communist Hungary or Czechoslovakia? So that proved to be a challenge. Yes, sir.
Bob Harris. Yeah, you mentioned that there was 100,000 people that came forward and wanted prosecution or something in Eastern Germany. You didn't mention how many people came forward in Poland. Then you mentioned another country in Eastern or Central Europe where 250,000 people came forward. And so I would imagine that in these countries you have these tremendous numbers that are coming forward that with complaints and want prostitution. Restitution. So I think your point is that on that, I mean, these countries were just trying to reestablish themselves and build strength in their governments. They didn't have the judicial system to handle this type of thing,
Exactly.
within, any rule of law. I mean, that we can say unequivocally.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if they started concentrating on these things, they would never have had the opportunity to start building their social, economic, political structures of their states. So I want to ask you that. That's one question. The second question is, what was the motivation of a lot of these people? Did they want monetary reparation? Do they want prosecution? They want these people to go to jail? Or they just wanted these people to apologize? Or
Well, very good. I think they are related. I was referring to the number of people who were actually tried or indicted, tried, I think I said, in Germany on account of crimes committed under communism in East Germany. So, but of those 100,000 who were charged, only something like 650 were actually sentenced. And many received suspended sentences. So,
Sorry, I thought those were
no, well, there's and I didn't talk about that much, but one of the important an important set of policies had to do with the rehabilitation of former political prisoners. That is, an official statement saying you were wrongfully sent to jail, and when the state is responsible, there ought to be, as recognized by principles of most legal systems, some kind of a restitution. So a whole host of restitution policies was born. They range from property restitutions on the principle of what was stolen must be returned. And actually most extensive restitutions took place in Germany and in Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic. But these things still are going on. It's quite amazing. Only last year, a law was passed in the Czech Republic stating that people who had in some ways been active in the fight against communism and can prove it should be recognized as members of, resistance to communism. And if they suffered, they would be entitled to a symbolic compensation. These are typically symbolic compensations. So, and even more recently, a law was passed after 23 years of debate in the Czech Republic about church restitutions, which is, a huge amount of money. And the state right now is really in bad economic shape. So it has caused a huge debate because the Czechs are among the most godless people in Europe. So why are you, suddenly restituting churches? It's not a popular measure. And this is just another way of illustrating how every time the government, actually the Constitutional Court a few years back said you have to address this issue because, what was stolen should be returned. But it didn't say how or at what level. So you have a policy that seeks to right the wrong, but it ignites a very negative response in the society and causing a huge debate about, what is justice and why are the churches being compensated when people who lost all their, who owned stocks after the war, when the communists came to power, didn't receive anything. So it just keeps going on. It took 23 years to get to this.
Okay, we have a question there.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michal Derko. I'm a visiting scholar at the Saltzman Institute. I would like to ask you a question that strikes me as very surprising. Why do Central European countries have bigger problems to come to terms with their Second World War legacy than with the communist legacy? I mean, everyone is big on restituting property that was stolen under communist regimes. Try to drop restitution for the property stolen under Beneš decrees, and your political career is over. And I mean, you are certainly aware of the case of Mr. Kalina, who said that he would never go to memorial of the first republic, the first Slovak Republic, and he was immediately withdrawn by the government from the position to become the future chair of the Slovak Institute of National Memory. So why do they have such a problem to come to terms with the World War II history than with the communist one? Thank you very much.
Well, how far back do we go? When Havel made his first visit to Sweden, In the early 1990s, he wondered if the Swedes might want to return some of the stuff they took back in the 1600s. But that's obviously not a serious answer to your question. Well, the Second World War, in a sense, is still a can of worms. In Slovakia, this very institute that I mentioned, where Mr. Kalina was a candidate, it sort of was taken over by the nationalists, so that they are trying to have the institute serve the purpose. They have sort of nationalized the institute to celebrate. That's an exaggeration, but to protect the legacy of the Slovak independent state, which, in some ways wasn't much to brag about. It was a puppet state of the wartime Germany. So there's tensions, and this reflects the politics again of these. Well, it reflects the political balance of power in Slovakia. What's happened with that institute? The Beneš issue. Well, some crimes are so enormous that, I quoted Karel Schwarzenberg. So, it's been put to rest, at least in terms of the official relations with Germany. But if you were to undo the line which says we deal with the crimes of the communist regime, at least in terms of the, at least in terms of the this issue. But you're right that there is from the point of view of those who were affected by this, it seems like a terrible inconsistency, and clearly something that the Czech government still owes or should account for. So I don't think it was by accident that they chose the mission of this Czech institute to deal with the Second World War, and then there is a gap of 3 years, and then it's from 1948 again. I think that may have something to do with what happened after the war.
I think we have time for one last question over there, and then
Yes.
we'll continue informally over coffee or whatever.
My name is Milena Mikhailova. I'm from Bulgaria, and I'm doing my PhD research here in Colombia. And I'm researching the U.S. companies performing in the Central Eastern European countries. And I would ask you the following. To what extent do you think that the transitional justice is affecting the business climate? Because from my personal point of view, all those American companies, they prefer to do business in the countries which revealed all that information already. And in countries like Albania and Bosnia and all the Central Eastern European countries that are putting that information not in public, there are not so many U.S. companies doing business there.
I see. So if I understood your question correctly, you are doing research on
the U.S. companies,
right,
doing
and these
business in
companies prefer to invest in those countries.
Czech Republic, Poland, Romania.
I see. Where there's a correlation
Yes.
at least.
To
Right.
what extent do you think is the correlation between the fact that all those countries, they are not revealing that information in public?
Well, I'm not. I will defer to Jan when it comes to American business. But my inclination would be to say that I don't think American businesses are that sensitive to this issue. I think they look for opportunities in terms of business and return, and clearly some countries. I mean, there may be a correlation between these transitional justice measures and how extensive they are, and more general respect for the term you don't like, the rule of law. But so that there's probably less corruption in countries that are trying to address these legacies than there is in those where things are left unaddressed. So there may be, you may have to look deeper, as social scientists like to say, disaggregate this data to separate these influences. But perhaps you can make a interesting case.
All right. On that note, let me thank you all for participating. Let me thank Michael Kraus and Timothy Fry for the presentations, and let's move to a more informal setting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.